So, Witchcraft. Yeah, no, I thought this deck was going to be pretty good, and it's not. It's actually really bad. And so in today's video, I'm going to talk about Witchcraft and why it's heavily disappointing, and honestly, this deck is just flat out garbage. Like, it's not like the worst deck ever, but it is so fragile and it requires so much resource commitment for such a fragile engine that I just don't see it being like a good deck whatsoever. But anyways, let's get right into this. So to start, we have the monsters, and the monsters are going to have effects. All the level 4, level 3, and level 2 monsters are going to have effects where you can tribute them, discard one spell, and special summon a Witchcraft monster from your deck. So the reason why this is relevant is because they also all have grave effects, and from there you can send your, for example with the fire one, you can send a Witchcraft card from your deck to the graveyard by banishing it. One will say if you have no cards in your hand, you can banish and add a card from your grave to your hand, or you will have one that says draw one then discard one, and if you have no Witchcraft cards in your hand to discard for this effect, that means that you banish your entire hand instead. So these are kind of the quote-unquote like grave effects of these Witchcraft monsters. And honestly, after reading the fire one, because that was spoiled a while ago before we got the rest of the announcements, I thought this deck was going to be so much better. I mean, think about it, like honestly, a card that can foolish like that and basically a lone fire, I mean, count me in, and it's a quick effect. So I thought it was just going to be that card that was like the nuts to draw, but you're not going to like draw it every single turn. That's not like going to be a staple effect in the Witchcraft monsters. Well, it turns out that it actually is a staple in all the Witchcraft monsters, and now we will see Witchcraft monsters that are basically lone fire blossoms. Now, another issue with these monsters is that they are all inherent neg 1s. So the reason why this deck is supposed to work, or the way it's supposed to work, is you're supposed to discard your Witchcraft spells. Now, I'll get to those a bit later, but basically the idea is you can use a Witchcraft monster to special summon another from deck, and they can be big Witchcraft monsters, whatever, and then eventually over time you will get your Witchcraft cards back and keep recurring resources over time. However, there are a couple issues, and they are pretty major issues in this idea. So to start, obviously the Witchcraft monsters are lone fire blossoms, and they require you to discard one as cost. So the biggest issue is if a Witchcraft monster gets ashed, you are literally screwed. Like, that ends your turn, and then your opponent can do whatever the heck they want, because you need to resolve that Witchcraft monster effect. If you don't believe me, what disruption is Witchcraft going to play besides the inherent ones? Yes, you can go ahead and use the Monster Reborn spell in order to bring back a Witchcraft from your grave, but then you can't use its effect again because you can only use each effect once per turn. So how could this deck work that way? How does this deck even play through 2 disruption? It can maybe play through 1 disruption in a good scenario, but then how does it beat 2? If your deck literally loses to 1 ash, then you're probably not a good deck. Sky Striker, for example, doesn't lose to an ash because it just does more and more and more. So if your deck completely loses to 1 Ash Blossom, but the rest of the meta doesn't lose to an Ash Blossom, then why would your deck be so good? I mean, if we see Ash in so many decks, even though it's going on a downward trend as of right now, if we see Ash in so many decks, then why would we want to play a deck that literally loses to that 1 card? This deck loses entirely, especially entirely, to Call by the Grave. Call by the Grave cripples this deck because you're just losing so much value. Now, okay, the spells do replace themselves in a way, which again, I'll get to that in a second, but basically the entire premise that you have to discard a spell to resolve the Witchcraft monsters is just really not that great. Obviously, I've already described that there's grave utilization with the form of being able to foolish a card, etc. The spells will have grave utilization, which I'll get to again, but if you can banish a Witchcraft from your grave to special one from deck, then that's an entirely different story, and then a Witchcraft to add one, etc. That is an entirely different story, because then every single card will get you some form of a plus. But the issue is, this deck does not give you inherent pluses. In fact, you're inherently going neg, and you might get 1 plus or 2, but the real problem is, then at that point, you've already committed, and while yes, sometimes you may go +1, okay, cool, Salomon Greats will go +3 or 4, very easily with just 1 to 2 cards. And the only inherent one that actually technically pluses is the level 2 Earth. But the inherent issue with that one is it requires you to have no cards in your hand, and you always want to have a card in your hand so that way you can activate the spells. Now obviously the spells have an effect that can retrieve them during your end phase, but again we'll get to that in a second, but even then that's not really as good. This is basically promoting the idea that you want to have an empty hand so that way you can use the level 2 Earth, which honestly it's not that hard to fill out your entire hand, put it all in the grave, and then maybe try and get it all back. But if you don't have a Witchcraft monster on the field, then you can't get your spells back. And already, as I've already stated, this deck just doesn't do enough with the graveyard. Again, the spells are great and all, but if you don't control a Witchcraft monster, then they don't do anything. The Witchcraft monsters inherently need some way to plus in the graveyard, and obviously the sending one from deck is really nice, but then when you can't really capitalize on that effectively immediately, then there becomes an issue. And that's one other big issue with the Witchcraft deck. Sky Striker is different because you can actually play, like, instead of having to immediately go to your end phase to replenish your resources, you can immediately replenish your resources. However, Witchcraft can't do that because of the fact that it just doesn't plus enough immediately, and all the spells will retrieve themselves during the end phase. You can also make the argument that there are not enough good spells to discard. So you can play some good generic spells, like for example Twin Twister, Call by the Grave, but those don't do anything for you if they're in the graveyard, and so that way you're just going inherently neg on that trade. So typically you want to either discard a Witchcraft spell, or you want to discard a value spell, for example Metalfoes Fusion, World Dino Wrestling, etc. These monsters don't even give you enough disruption. So there are 2 Witchcraft monsters that give you disruption. One will pop a face-up card by discarding a spell, and one will, well, blanket negate everything your opponent controls by discarding a spell. So honestly, this deck can out a board of Thunder Dragon, Colossus, but then you have to deal with the other 2 negates as well. And plus the one that will target and destroy a card also has targeting protection for the rest of your monsters, so that's pretty good. So yes, there are 2 sources of interruption, but I think one big thing this deck would have liked is some sort of spell that you could use from your hand in order to disrupt your opponent. That would have made this deck honestly immensely better. If that was a card, this would be an entirely different discussion. If it was like a Widow Anchor but you can activate it from your hand, oh man, then we're talking. But honestly, it's not that, and the spells are a lot worse than you think. So yeah, we'll get to that in a second. So overall, the monsters are pretty decent. They're not like superb, and they all inherently go neg 1, plus it's a very fragile monster lineup. But hey, what can you do? If you resolve the effects, then maybe it's good, but this deck just loses to 1 Ash, so that doesn't sound that good whatsoever. The next part about this deck is the spells, and so we have a wide variety of spells, even though like some of them are just terrible. One gives you a search for any Witchcraft monster, one will give you a Monster Reborn, and one will give you a battle and card effect protection, which is a continuous spell which doesn't conflict with its other effect. But then the big catch here is that all of the spells also have an additional effect, where if you control a Witchcraft monster during your end phase, you can add the spell back to your hand. The biggest issue with these spells is the fact that they said you can only use 1 effect per turn and only once that turn. So the reason why this is such a big deal is because if I wanted to go ahead and use a Witchcraft spell, that means I cannot retrieve it during the end phase. And so with that, I'm taking a 1-for-1 trade, but then from there, I'm going neg in the future because my Witchcraft monster will make me discard a card. So for example, if I wanted to use the Rhoda, and then from there, I search a monster, that's just a 1-for-1. That's not getting me any inherent value immediately. In fact, I have to wait an additional turn after I already got the search in order to gain a plus from that card. So that's really not that good, and you have to be very careful with what you do with the Witchcraft spells. Yes, there are some pretty generically good spells, but at the same time, is it really warranted to put you can only use 1 effect per turn? The fact that it has has that one statement on it literally kills the entire potential of this deck. This deck can have at minimum 1 negation or 1 disruption at all, and honestly, you still have to discard a spell for that effect. The other big thing is there is no disruption spell. If, again, as I've already stated, if there was a disruption spell, then this would be an entirely different story, and I think depending on how good that disruption spell is, maybe this deck would be significantly better. But the fact that this deck is just so fragile, it just does not do enough, it does not gain enough advantage, all of your monsters are inherent neg ones. Just because of all of this and the fact that you cannot immediately gain advantage like a deck like Sky Striker, well, that just kind of kills Witchcraft. And overall, I want to say Witchcraft is heavily disappointing, and honestly, I would not recommend picking this deck up when it comes out in Infinity Chasers. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to support me further than just watching my YouTube videos, go down into the description and support me on Patreon. It helps out quite immensely. As well, if you guys want to talk to me further than just my YouTube comment section, go down into the description and join my Discord server. Thank you guys so much for watching, and with that, I hope to see you soon.